But that's only my summary, and I think now it's more appropriate that I hand over to Professor Phoenix herself. She's going to speak on energetic openings, intersectional psychology, and social justice trajectories. We're very, very pleased that she's agreed to deliver this keynote lecture on behalf of the Culture and Social Psychology Research Strand of our new Open Psychology Research Centre. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Stephanie, for what a wonderful introduction. And I feel really proud to have been part of this department that has opened up this wonderful centre. So I would like to absolutely start with a toast myself. I hope that you can see this. To the centre, because it seems to me that it's absolutely timely to have such a centre that is completely dedicated to bringing together psychologists and their work in order to open up psychology, and to do so in the service of change in changing times. So I'm very proud to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I really think that this centre couldn't have happened at a better time, a time of crisis in the world, and also that it promises so very much. So it's entirely auspicious. Thank you for that. And what I want to do in this talk is, first of all, to stay with this notion of changing times and talk a bit about theorizing changing times. And I then want to think about ways in which psychologists have opened up psychology and therefore can point to the future of opening up psychology. And I want to include in that thinking about Jerome Bruner's work. And I hope you'll see why in a while, a psychologist who lived a long time and died earlier this century, but who was also linked with the Open University. And then finally, I want to give some research examples and think about working towards what I see as crucially important, an intersectional psychology, and one where the trajectories are to do with social justice. And from everything that we've heard this morning, from the other talks that there have been in this protracted launch of the centre, it's absolutely clear that social justice is at the heart of the opening of psychology that this centre is doing, has already done in its short life, and plans to do. And I think that this is absolutely the way to go for psychology and what we need for society. So what I want to argue is that we have to develop sustainable social justice trajectories in psychology, and that in order to do that, we have to think at this moment about the way in which the unexpected transformational conjunctions that have happened in our contemporary times produce shifts in social understanding, disjunctions sometimes, shifts in relations, and also shifts in orientations to social justice. And in order to work with those shifts and to produce something that we want, there have to be energetic collaborations. And that's one of the really brilliant reasons for having a centre, to see new collaborations across areas that might not have thought of collaborating before, across people who might not have thought about collaborating, and over time, in pursuit of a more holistic understanding that can open up psychological perspectives. And when I say holistic, I don't mean a way of understanding psychology that's monocausal. I mean really complex, and understanding the whole of people, the whole of the groups to which they belong, and so on. And then intersectional. I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by intersectionality in a little while, but that understanding that we cannot understand people or open up psychology without understanding that everybody is multiply positioned in sometimes contradictory ways all the time, and that we need to think about the ways in which people are in shifting allegiances with other people because they belong to many different groups simultaneously. And that those groups have histories, so that we have to be socio-historically sensitive in our analyses, and that all of that is central to opening psychology for changing times. Well, thanks to the ongoing pandemic, say Peter Backer and John Elkington, the world is off balance. We really are in changing times. And Backer and Elkington, writing for the World Economic Forum, say that the world will remain off balance for years to come. And that although some people are talking about building a new normal, that we won't have a new normal. Far from settling into a new normal, we should expect a COVID-19 domino effect, triggering further disruptions, positive as well as negative, over the decade ahead. And what they say will be a true recovery is about building back better. Now, we've heard that said a great deal, building back better, to reset if we are to address the deep systemic vulnerabilities the pandemic has exposed. And I think that's key, that one of the things that the pandemic has done is to show us that there are already existing inequalities, that it's broadened, it's widened, and that it's forced onto public attention. But when we talk about unexpected transformational conjunctions, it's not just the pandemic that's led to these. Before COVID-19, we already were being asked to rethink our own lives and society through Extinction Rebellion and through the school climate strikes that Greta Thunberg inaugurated. And that was having a really big impact already and continues to do so on society. So into that setting came COVID-19 with all the disruptions that it brought, with all the new ways of understanding that it brought, and the recognition that we are all linked together in trying to find a way forward. And then added to that mix was George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter. And the resurgence was already an organisation, Black Lives Matter, has meant that many people have come to think and see things in a new way. And on top of that, in Britain, the murder of Sarah Everard, simply walking home early in the evening, together with understandings that her murder generated an explosion of anger about the way women are treated and have to live their lives on the street, but that it was different for her as a white woman from the murders of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, who'd been murdered not that long before in a park as well. These are sisters, and yet hadn't produced the same outrage. So here we have something that shifts our having to grapple with the way in which women are forced to live their lives in public, and then the recognition, as with Black Lives Matter, and because of Black Lives Matter, that racialization still makes a difference. So all these things together, and if you go around the world, there are many other things that have been happening that have produced transformational conjunctions for good and ill. And all of them produce an explosion of personal narratives, and personal narratives in the service of political change and social justice. So people are telling about things that have happened to them. They're using those rather in the way that second waves feminists talked about the personal being political. And these conjunctions have both enabled and intensified public reactions to them that have sometimes been oppositional and sometimes in absolute recognition that change has to be for the better. What they've served to do is to disrupt the opposition between the individual psychological and the social. In other words, they've underlined in yet another new way how crucial it is to take a psychosocial perspective, and highlighted the importance of recognizing that we cannot think only, for example, of generation to do with school climate strikes, or to do with ethnicity and racialization, to do with George Floyd's murder, or just gender, as in Sarah Everard, Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, that we have to think about the ways in which people are always multiply positioned simultaneously. So it really is a timely period and an auspicious period for inaugurating this Open Psychology Research Centre. And I think that one of the reasons that it's so important is that there is now incremental dissatisfaction with the status quo. Nothing like a crisis for helping people to crystallize those dissatisfactions, and then a commitment to future change. And in order to really fulfill its promise, the great hope that we all have in it, psychology as a discipline and the centre has to be able to mirror social multiplicity, complexity and diversity if it is to be relevant. And we have so many people, I've already mentioned Building Back Better, but Joe Biden believing that it's no time to build back the way things were, but that we have to imagine and build a new American economy for our families and the next generation. Imagination is key. We have to see things differently. And also Arundhati Roy, the novelist and activist in India, talking about nothing could be worse than a return to normality. And historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past in order to imagine their worlds anew. And this one is no different. We have to be prepared to fight for the world that we want to see. So one of the things that crisis does is to accelerate change. And if we're to understand it, we need to theorize differently. We need theoretical understandings fit for the time. And what I want to deal with is the simultaneity of processes of social change together with stasis, why some things don't change, why there's a pull back into old ways, the desire sometimes to build back exactly the same way. And that means, as I've said already, the centrality of intersectional complexity and thinking about contradictory identities, because intersectionality, being multiply positioned, means that we have to think in complex ways, we have to theorize, our theories have to match that complexity and those contradictions. But so too, we have to understand that there are psychosocial eruptions because there are unacknowledged histories, both long histories and shorter personal histories. And we saw that with the toppling, for example, of Edward Colston, when people saying enough is enough, Black Lives Matter, actually wanted symbols of the past to be removed, to be erased from society. So we have to think in Foucauldian terms about the way in which history provides us with conditions of possibility, and we are living those. So too, it's important to think about Jacques Derrida's terms that's been picked up in the social sciences in more ways than Derrida actually theorized, but hauntology, both thinking about ontology, the nature of being, and the way in which the past haunts the future and certainly haunts the current. So we think, therefore, about the interlinking of the personal and the socio-historical. And here, Lucy Thompson, writing in Feminism and Psychology, says trauma is personal, but not individual. So the personal, the socio-historical have to be seen together. And she argues through her research that trauma is produced, situated, felt, and negotiated through institutions. It is not an individual issue. Colin Davis talks about the way in which undisclosed traumas of previous generations disturb the lives of their descendants, even and especially if they know nothing about their distant causes. That's hauntology, that you don't need to know the history for histories to be passed on from one generation to another and to disturb the lives of people long into the future. And whether some people feel a nostalgia for lost futures and other people want to disrupt the futures that have come from the past, Derrida's notion that there is a nostalgia for lost futures that is about hauntology is a really important one. Jill Bradbury, a South African psychologist, talks about the way, thinking about South Africa in particular, but very relevant for all of us, that collective histories inform our current individual modes of being, and the traces of the past create the contours of present life and constrain our imaginative future projections. In other words, how we can see the future that we aim towards is very much constrained by unacknowledged pasts, collective pasts. And we have to think about those, we have to theorize those, make them visible in new ways. So intersectionality, which I've already mentioned so many times. Patricia Hill Collins has written a great deal about intersectionality, and indeed she was doing intersectional work long before Kimberlé Crenshaw coined the term in 1989. And Kimberlé Crenshaw would be the first to acknowledge that many people were struggling towards doing intersectional work without a term that gave it an easy way of being recognized and a heuristic for reminding us all that we need to think intersectionally. But Patricia Hill Collins and Sioma Bilgey, in their 2016 book, the second edition 2019, say that there are 6 core ideas to intersectionality. 1, that it addresses social inequality. 2, that it's about power. 3, relationality. And we might bring those 2 and 3 together and think in a Foucauldian way about power relations, but both of those matter. 4th, that there's a significance of historical social context. So what I've just been saying about how collective histories impact on the contemporary, the personal contemporary, and imagined futures. That we can't avoid complexity as the 5th point, and that social justice is key as well. So Leah Warner, who's also done a great deal of work in psychology on intersectionality, says in general, scholars agree that intersectionality is defined as the mutually constitutive relations among social identities. In other words, intersectionality is the idea that social identities, such as race, gender, and class, interact to form qualitatively different meanings and experiences. And one of the key points of intersectionality is that it's not that one adds together different social categories to which people belong, but that they mutually constitute each other. So their meanings are different in different contexts, different places, and over time as well. They make each other up. Well, I want to move on now to thinking about the opening of psychology and the way in which, for example, Jerome Bruner has helped us to think about psychology as open. And if we are to have an open psychology, we need to be open to people, and that means not reproducing the exclusion of certain people from theorizing, but to include everyone. We need to be open to addressing inequalities. We need to be open to methods, new methods, combinations of old methods, and so on. And we need to be open to complex contextualization. And I want to give the example here of disrupting existing power relations through thinking about who's included in. And I'm very struck by the Inclusive Data Task Force set up by the National Statistician and the Office for National Statistics. And they have done this because they recognize that over the next 5 years, they need statistics to be radical, ambitious, sustainable, and inclusive, and that the inclusive principle needs to ensure, and to quote, our statistics and our workforce reflect the experiences of everyone in our society, so that everyone counts and is counted, and no one is forgotten. And they recognize that statistics have not included in everyone. And I think an excellent example of that for me was, my horror at discovering only in 2019 that while rates of maternal death are low in this country, thank goodness, that Black women are more than 4 times likely to die in childbirth and just after than white women, that Asian women are more than 2 times than white women likely to die. And this has not been known because there have not been records kept on these things. And yet there are all sorts of ways in which Black people, Asian people are counted, but not always the ways in which it would be helpful to them. And so I'm very pleased to be on the Inclusive Data Task Force as somebody who's not a statistician, and this will be reporting soon. But coming back to psychology, this is relevant in that one of the terms that I coined in the 1980s was a normalized absence, pathologized presence, and it's still relevant. In fact, sometimes more relevant now than 30 years ago, because it's not that unusual to find that studies that are concerned with really understanding the normative and so adding to the normative exclude those who are seen as non-normative in the first place. So Black people quite often, and children and mothers, but also frequently those from the working classes, the poorest sections of societies, and also those with disabilities and so on. And that exclusion does not hold when it comes to studying the non-normative, studying things that are already deemed to be problematic or pathological, when there might be whole studies of Black families, for example. So the normalized absence, pathologized presence, means that change never happens. For example, Black families never get a chance to influence what is seen as the norm, even though the norm is being studied. It's never being expanded to reflect what are normative practices across society. So psychology has to be open to that, open to people in this way. It has to recognize also positionality, and that those doing the research are equally positioned as those who are being researched. So even though psychology goes in for a lot of experiments that have been illuminating in many ways, that sometimes not recognizing that the researchers themselves bring particular understandings with them to their interpretations, to the questions they ask, to how they do their research, to who they include in, is absolutely problematic. And that needs to change. Because together, those things reproduce ad nauseam what William Ryan called in 1981, blaming the victim. The normalized absence, pathologized presence, the failure to recognize that researchers themselves bring particular mindsets to their research, end up again and again blaming people who are not responsible for sustaining and maintaining inequalities. So Jerome Bruner, and I think that he is certainly exemplary. He's a unique psychologist. And I would characterize his work as sustained psychological dynamism that was concerned with holistic understandings and with promoting equalities, disrupting inequalities. Bruner had a very long life. He died just before he was 101 in 2016. And in the 1950s, he led the cognitive revolution against behaviorism. So he saw that humans should not be seen as just behaviors. Not that behaviors were not important, but that humans were thinking people. So he led a cognitive revolution and contributed a great deal to it. Between the 60s and the 90s, he did a great deal on child development and learning. And perhaps my earliest experience of Bruner was in the 80s, looking at some of his work with children, with babies, infants with their mothers. And he pioneered naturally occurring videotaped interactions, along with other people, of course. but he contributed to that a great deal. He gave us the term scaffolding to think about the ways in which children are scaffolded by the adults in their lives to learn and to get new understandings of different things, but that this also happens in education. He helped to establish the USA Head Start program in the 1960s deliberately to address inequalities and inequalities, including racialized inequalities in the United States. In the 1980s, he certainly led the social revolution against overcognitivism. So he came to a social constructivist theory of meaning that was interpersonal, intersubjective. It was about collaborative processes of creating shared meaning, whether that was with teachers and children or with adults and their children at home. He was concerned with processes of collaborative meaning making. And from that, he came to thinking about the narrative construction of identities as crucially important, and later on, legal psychology as well. And he was in the 1990s as well a critical reader for the Open University social psychology courses, and a Bruner Prize was established in recognition both of his wonderful career and also of what he contributed towards Open University psychology. So he had 70 years of prolific psychological research, and I've put in this PowerPoint some of the books that he authored. There are many more, of course, and one of the things about being able to influence work in psychology is, of course, to do it over a long period, but one doesn't have to do it on one's own. The wonderful thing about the centre is that one can progress through collaboration in ways that one couldn't so quickly on one's own. So collaboration, again, really key. And one of the things, I won't read all these things that I picked out as things that Bruner has said, amongst hundreds of things I could have picked, of course, but that he saw humans as homo neurans, storytelling people, and that language acquisition was very much about being able to communicate the stories that one has to tell to others, but also that we make and account for ourselves through the stories we tell to ourselves and to other people about our autobiographies, about who we are. And what I should also say is that one of the things about Bruner is, of course, he went against the tide. I'll come back to that in a moment, but that having shown how he made contributions to shifting psychological thinking didn't mean that it was easy, that this was something that everybody saw, or that he didn't get a lot of flack for doing so. I want to move on to give one example from social identity theory to do with the pandemic. And here, Van Bavel and 41 other people, and one of the things I've been really partly surprised by and very, very pleased with is that in the pandemic, many social psychologists, particularly in social identity theory backgrounds, have come together to think about how we can deal with the pandemic in the best possible ways. And they've often done this through social identity theory and through behavioral science. So here, Van Bavel and others say that a priority for leaders is to create a sense of shared social identity among their followers. People tend to prefer leaders who cultivate a sense that we are all in this together, that, you know, this is, that the leaders themselves are one of us, rather than working against us, that they're working for us and for the interests of the group, that they treat us with respect, because we will all do more together if we believe that things are in our interests and that we are part of an us, that there is a we-ness that is being appealed to by leaders. So that leaders both have to treat us with respect and trust us as well as creating a sense of shared social identities. So too, psychologists have attempted to understand things like Black Lives Matter fairly quickly. So Kelly and colleagues talk about the importance of highlighting broader history and macro level context and their interrelatedness in order to grasp the ubiquity of systemic racism. So in other words, we have to break with thinking that these are individual incidents occurring now and recognize that we bring our histories with us, all of us, and that we therefore need to think about the macro level context and how that's historicized. So it helps to detail key historical events to understand racism, to understand the macro level context, and therefore, as many people have said already, in thinking about this centre, that it has to work with other disciplines. Interdisciplinary perspectives are important. So Bruner's example and those other examples that I've just given, and all those examples from the launch of this centre that you've already heard and that you will hear later today, show that what we need in order to make real change is commitment to social justice, for example, collaboration, that's key, we can't get around that, but courage. And I think courage to, I think it's very well exemplified in Jerome Bruner's case, who, for example, eventually had to leave Oxford because they were interested in his experimental work on cognitive psychology rather than his move into the social so much. Also about critical engagement, that Bruner and indeed the other psychologists working at the moment to make a difference for the better of social justice have to think critically about their own work and to think critically about the discipline and to be prepared to change. So change through critical engagement is key. But they also have to persevere. And those examples show, for example, social identity theory. It's decades old now, since the 70s when it began to gain a foothold in psychology. And people have worked away at trying to think through why identities matter, how they matter, and drawing in understandings from other areas of psychology to make a difference, so perseverance. And within this, I think what's often missing is intersectionality, even though intersectionality is implicit, but it's often not addressed. So I want to move on in the final part of the talk just to give a few examples from my own research, but not only my own research, to think about working towards an intersectional psychology and social justice trajectories. And I'm not doing this to say that I've got the answers, but just to use some small examples to think together about how we might do intersectional analyses on whatever it is that we are studying and how that might help us move along the social justice trajectories that we find important. And the background to this is, of course, recognition, as I've already indicated, that we as researchers cannot stand aside and think that we're socially distanced from the people we research, the questions that we raise, the way we interpret, and so on. And Mathner and Doucette put this really well in 2003 when they say there's widespread recognition that the interpretation of data is a reflexive exercise through which meanings are made rather than found. And I think that that's really important. One of the things that is crucial from the examples I've given so far, from thinking about the issues that the crisis has shown that we need to address, is understanding everyday complexities, not simply as mundane and to be brushed aside, but as key to real change, as key to good psychological understandings. So Valerie Walkerdine, who has done decades of work, which includes putting social class and thinking about the working classes, including them in psychological work, as well as being one of the authors of the book Changing the Subject, which every generation since 1984 has had a new edition, and has been really key to helping us see that psychology itself helps to often to maintain the social quo in terms of power relations, and why it does so and how it could change. Well, in a paper published in 2017, Valerie Walkerdine says, we must understand the complex affective histories and entanglements as they relate to lives across the class divide. Urban, rural, middle and working class, black and white, gay and straight, other possibilities and sexualities. So history comes into the everyday, it's complex, it's emotionally entangled, we are all entangled together. So the divides that we make, that we construct across categories, need to be disrupted through understanding of complexity. And there are many tools that we already have from psychologists. And I've put this particular image here of a hand painted in the Union flag, and also coinage in the hand, because Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism, it seems to me, helps us to understand how history comes into the everyday in unacknowledged, unseen ways. When he talks about flagging the nation daily through the symbols that we have, and indeed now politicians have been asked to use the Union flag, to have it showing in their rooms much more often, but on coinage that we have the Queen's head, that we have contestations over history lived out in the flagging of the everyday all the time. And the narratives that therefore we tell, our narrative storytelling, includes complex affective histories in Valerie Walkerdine's terms. So I want to give, first of all, just 3 quick examples from a study that I did with Maria Peltola, who did all the interviews in Helsinki, Finland, because I don't speak Finnish at all, when I was living there a couple of years ago. And this is a study of masculinities in 12 to 15-year-old boys, and really showing the way that their trajectories of home are dynamic. This is a tiny part of the study, the way they talked about home, but nonetheless important. And it fits with what Penelope Eckert talks about in her work of the ways in which young people make themselves the next step older. And she's talking about it in the heterosexual marketplace, but they do this throughout their lives, that becoming older is not simply something that happens to children and young people, but that they actively engage in. And I think this is apparent in these examples. So Maria asks, so it's changed a lot here. Elias, yeah. Earlier, I used to prefer staying home a bit more to being with friends. Nowadays, I prefer being a lot more out. I sit with friends rather than be at home. And Johannes, are there some things that you do, for instance, only with your dad or only with your mom? Not really. I don't have anything, because it is what in this age it is. Only one wants a bit to work oneself loose from parents, as it is at this age. When I was little, I didn't really dare to do anything. Nowadays, I have more courage, but I do know what is reasonable and what is not. Alexei, what kind of things they are then that you talk with your parents, for instance? Just something like, they ask, how's it been in school? So I answer like approximately what has happened. But I don't, of course, if there has been, for instance, a bigger issue or something, then I don't now necessarily talk about it, because then it might cause a bigger hassle. And my friends don't want that, in a way that, so in other words, he's saying that his friends don't want his parents to know everything that they do, and particularly if friends don't know each other that well. And that might seem, well, you know, there it is, you know, in Helsinki only, and, you know, what's intersectional or socio-historical about that? It's so mundane. But one of the things that I would say is, of course, this doesn't only happen in Helsinki. I was sitting soon after analysing that on a London Underground train and heard two young men of just slightly older than our sample in Helsinki, one saying to the other, and I don't want you to tell your parents that, because I don't want this to get back to my parents. I don't want them to know. And I found that fascinating, but more fascinating because of what it shows in terms of both intersectionality and socio-historical positioning. So what I think it shows is that there are clearly intersections of gender, because, you know, the boys are going out into the world in a slightly different way than girls do at this age, but also generation. They're definitely differentiating themselves from their parents, and their age matters as well. But also intersections to do with geographies. While I heard the same things in London as in Helsinki, it is the case that expectations of independence are different in Helsinki. And it starts from very early on, where, for example, children, when they start school at 7, are expected to go to school alone, partly because they go to neighbourhood schools, so they're not going to be crossing busy roads in the same way, but that also all the junctions have crossing points for them, so that they are expected to be independent, but then they're expected to be more independent after school. They go home alone. It's not expected that people will be necessarily there to greet them from very early on, and so on. But it's also psychosocial histories of expecting safety and trustworthiness and early independence too. And therefore, the way in which it's expressed, even though the same thing is said, is different in Helsinki than in London. And it's also racialized and with social class intersections. And of course, in the small examples that I've shown you, that's not evident. But when one looks at all the accounts and thinks about the histories of hobbies and leisure, now in Helsinki, as in all the Nordic countries, children are expected to do a lot of hobbies out of school. So it wasn't unusual for young people to tell us that maybe they had 6 things that they did after school and at weekends, outside the home and outside school. But of course, even though this is a very affluent country, there are distinctions, and there were some children who could not afford to do those hobbies in the same way, and to have the kit and equipment that is required often in doing these hobbies. And then too, acceptance amongst peers was racialized and also had a social class impact as well. And what could be taken for granted about the household supporting independence safely and where young people could go was certainly intersectional. And of course, we could do a lot more in analysing the full accounts, but also even the little bits that I've shown you. A very different example of a study that was done here at the Open University on the transition to motherhood, and that involved Heather Elliott as the person who did a lot of data collection, although Wendy Holway and I also did a fair amount of data collection in a London borough. And it's about the transition to motherhood. It's a longitudinal study where their mothers were followed from pregnancy up until their children were a year old. And here is a white South African, Afrikaans origin mother who has come over to Britain at the invitation of the government in order to teach in schools where there were not enough teachers. And at this point, she's contemplating going back in a way that she hadn't before, because her husband's been offered a job in South Africa. And she says, oh, it's like 2 different worlds, completely different. Because here everything is like a city, like everything's so close to each other. And so we stay in a flat here, and we stay mainly also a very Asian community. A lot of Bengalis staying around. So the language obviously completely different. So when you walk in a shop, You don't understand what half the people are saying anyway. And Tower Hamlets is not a very rich area either. And with schooling as well, the standard of education in Tower Hamlets is not all that great anyway. So if I had to stay here, I would try, and we'd probably had to have moved out of London to get sort of nearer for him to go to school anyway. But when we go back home, there's going to be a big yard, big open spaces, a wider selection of schools. And also, if you drive here, traffic is just, oh, there's always construction everywhere. You get irritated just going to work for half the time. Whereas back home, it's just so laid back and relaxed and everything. So, I mean, here we feel very safe. We don't feel at all frightened in any way with any kind of danger. So, I mean, back home, you get things like hijacking or whatever. And I can't imagine thinking of sitting in a car and someone comes up and I've got the baby in the back seat. So that really scares me. But for family and all that kind of thing, I mean, we're going to go home at some stage anyway. So, but yeah, I'll miss it a bit. And what a complex of things are being said here. And one of the things that I think is going on is that she is using her own narrative to expand and diminish the spaces of possibilities across the two countries for her. And thinking about really how she idealizes South Africa in a way that she didn't in the previous two interviews where she'd expected to stay in Britain. But she idealizes it now while actually agreeing that she fears for her safety. So she's continually negotiating contradictions and contradictions in her positioning, in her intersectional positioning. And this is both psychosocial, it's psychological, it's thinking about the social context, and it's certainly emotional. And it's completely coded into her account that she's white, she's a mother, she's affluent, that she has expectations of moving into a new gated house and being able to live in a certain way there, and with South African history as the backdrop, that there is a post-apartheid hauntology in her account as well, to do with her fears, to do with what she thinks of the society. And as Jill Bradbury says about South Africa, an individual life history is entwined with the wider historical processes of our collective life, and the narrative self is never disconnected from the narratives of others, past, present, and future. We tell the story of our lives to others and can only tell these stories in the words or language of others. And then later on, she says, in South Africa, we often speak of the legacy of apartheid as referring to the continuing material effects of inequality and poverty. However, this legacy is also less material or tangible and forcefully felt in the visceral traces of racism that the segregationist system that no longer exists has left in our collective unconsciousness or consciousness. And that's really important, that within this account, and again, it would be great fun to spend a long time just analysing together that account. And of course, I have no time to do it, but all these things are coded into it. So as Hanna Meritoja says, she's a Finnish narrative scholar, narratives enlarge the space of possibilities in which you can act, think, and reimagine our world together with others, and how they restrain or impoverish this space. And I think we can really see that expansion and diminution in that account. And the last example I want to give is not mine at all, but is one that is very much part of the centre. And it's Johanna Motzkau's work on cultures of listening and dark listening. And this particular paper, which is in press, is with Nick Lee and is about psychology, resonance and justice. And they say the concept of cultures of listening is based on the idea that listening is not just an aspect of auditory perception or communication, but that listening is about how we understand, remember, record and share its result and the consequences of this for action. And I think that everything that I've been saying is about listening in a different way, listening to different people, recognizing that listening is not just simply hearing communication, but it's about the way in which we understand historically, understand inequalities and so on, and the way in which we share the results. And they go on to say, our interest in listening is not abstract in nature, but stems from experiencing and studying problems around listening within child protection practices. And that is what I love about this notion, that thinking about listening differently means that we have to apply it to the everyday in new ways, and apply it in ways better to understand, but also to be transformative. And exactly transforming is what psychology needs in its opening up for this centre. And it's not surprising that many people are thinking in new ways about how we can listen in the social sciences. So Leah Bassel, for example, has produced a recent book, The Politics of Listening, but this builds on Les Back at Goldsmiths College work on the art of listening earlier in the century. So people really thinking we have to listen in new ways. And Tina Kampt here, I've got two books by her here, Listening to Images, where she wants to think outside the frame of the image and to really, in this synesthetic way, get more understanding about the things that we are analysing by thinking outside the frame, listening to the images in a new way. And here, in A Black Gaze, thinking about the ways in which art allows us to see in different ways. So art can help us to understand the social sciences in new ways. And it's no surprise that many people are coming up with new methods. So that we have Saidiya Hartman, for example, thinking about critical fabulation. Gail Lewis, who also used to be in the psychology department, as well as being in social policy at the Open University, talking about presencing, new ways of bringing social science understandings into view, bringing new people, but not new people, but people who have not been seen in particular ways into view. That Christina Sharp talks about in the wake, that we have to think about, you know, how can we understand social life in the wake of enslavement, in the wake of slavery and what it meant. And while many people might have thought that this was largely irrelevant, I think what the resurgence of Black Lives Matter has shown, as well as recognition of things that we didn't necessarily know, like, for example, that it's only in 2015 that all of us stopped paying out taxes for reparations to slave owners. It took that long for that money to be paid off through our taxes. All of us paid it until 2015. Or in thinking, for example, about the new BBC series on descendants, how close enslavement is to all of us in the British context, linking us to the USA, to the Caribbean, to the African continent, including sometimes in ways that people find uncomfortable because they're also genetically linked. So to try to bring that together, what I really want to argue strongly is that we need new ways of understanding the social in psychological theorization, and that requires a disruptive reimagining. And my hope is that this centre will provide all of us in and out of it with ways to disruptively reimagine. And I think what we've heard so far in terms of the presentations gives me great hope that the centre will contribute to this. It cannot do it all, but that it will make an important contribution. And I think in order to do it, we need to recognise that psychologists are temporally, geographically, and institutionally located, that they're not objectively distant from what they study. We need to think about methodological plurality and give attention to the everyday in new ways, to understand the mundane afresh, and that we need to see how personal and social histories are part of the everyday and also of our imagined futures, together with the axiological commitment to social justice, so values pinned on social justice, and taking an intersectional psychosocially complex view, epistemologically and ontologically, in order to get holistic understanding. And once again, I want to drink a tea toast to the opening of this new centre and to give you energetic openings. I wish you energy in this opening and hope for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was wonderful. What we'll do now, I hope you can hear me, is we'll take a few minutes because I think you need to drink your tea and everyone else needs to catch their breath. And I would suggest that we reconvene at, to be very precise, 11:23, and then we will be hearing some responses, first from Johanna Motzkau, who you mentioned, and then from Jovan Byford, and then we'll take questions. And we've already got some on the notice board, but people might like to put up more. Thank you very much, Anne. Brilliant. Okay. Well, everyone, I'm very pleased now, as we return to the session, to introduce Johanna Motzkau from the CUSP strand of the Research Centre. And she's going to speak for just 5 minutes. If you have any more questions for Anne, for Johanna, for all of us prompted by this discussion and this interaction, please put them onto the bulletin board. And Johanna, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful. Fascinating, daunting, and flattering in equal measure, I should say. A journey through current and past transformative conjunctions, I really love that term, within and beyond psychology, highlighting the troubled but potentially transformative role psychology plays vis-a-vis socio-historical change and alerting us to the work of those who have persevered and actively shifted and opened up psychology in the past and are doing so now. A little bit daunting, as you hinted, at the risks involved and the courage required, but also flattering as you put this challenge to us. So thank you for that. Herein, your presentation, I think, is not so much about standing on the shoulders of giants or aspiring to some utopian future, but an effective reminder of what was and is possible when we continue to work from and with the transformative conjunctions that surround us and affect us collaboratively. And in this sense, I think what Anne gave us today is a form of dynamic scaffolding, the Open Psychology Research Centre towards imagining new futures, new pasts, and transformative methodologies for psychology, creating a kind of zone of proximal development for all of us to enter. Thanks for that as well. Unsurprisingly, I would love to hear more from Anne about listening in relation to narratives, thinking about the way narratives shape identities and expand as well as diminish spaces of possibilities, as your extract from research have shown, thinking this alongside the way cultures of listening, as I would call them, can evoke or mute narratives, can evoke and mute the turns such narratives take. As ultimately speaking, hearing and listening are entwined and conditional upon one another, as they each anticipate one another. And here would like my first slide, please, if that's available, Sam. As Jean-Luc Nancy puts it, it is as if in all hearing there was a hearing say, and in all saying there's a hearing, and in hearing itself there's a listening. And what he means by that is also captured in what Roland Barthes said, is that listening speaks. It speaks in that it brings an anticipated meaning, an imagined implied speaker or voice to the listening situation already. and thereby evokes certain understandings and mutes others. So based on these ideas, I'm developing a participatory method called dark listening that is designed to better understand cultures of listening and how they determine what is allowed to speak in our listening as we engage with the transformative conjunctions that surround us. And the idea of dark listening is that it has a transformative impetus and that it can become a way to highlight as well as disassemble troubled listening practices. So finally, I would like to follow Anne's example and use my remaining minute to add to the scaffolding that Chia has composed so beautifully, which is a patchwork, I think, of ongoing theoretical, methodological struggles with troubled listening and speaking practices. And I just want to point to the work of Simone Bignell, a friend and colleague located in political philosophy, thank you, Sam, from Australia. And here, her concept of ex-colonialism, I think, rings particularly interesting, brings interesting resonances. She describes in this bit of the paper, finding out that a house she has lived in for a time in Adelaide was set on the grounds of an ancient burial site for Indigenous Kaurna people in use until 1848. And she says, the encounter between the Indigenous ancestor and the colonizing settlers, including the gardeners, the landlords, and myself, is not only an encounter between individual entities, but is also a collision of communities and cultures. The burial represents an entire world of traditions of sacred knowledge and legal practice, which became practically forbidden on this site when the land was seized from the traditional owners by the colonizing community, divided up, fenced as private property. And yet this world persists, not only as past heritage, but as a present and living connection with culture through country and land. And its protection is the objective of Australian Indigenous peoples' ongoing efforts of resistance to the elimination and assimilation of their societies. Now, the just mediation, she says, of such diverse worlds is the imperative of what she calls ex-colonialism. And the ex here, she says, he uses the prefix in the same sense she would use ex to describe a former relationship which remains an indelible and shaping part of my own history, but which I'm no longer entangled in a defining manner. And one of those efforts to ex-colonialism is expressed in a legal agreement that she describes in another paper between Indigenous people in South Australia and the Adelaide Council, a law titled Listening to the Ngarrindjeri People Talking, which requires the council to engage in a program of education about how they should listen to the Indigenous people to understand their relational approach to care for the land. So this is a version that sort of describes an ex-colonial sentiment where the listening isn't assumed as something that takes place, but where the modes of listening first need to be understood, and where those listening understand that they might need educating in the manners and modes they should be listening. And so here, ex-colonialism is mindful of history associated with the event of settler colonization and affirms the continuing coexistence of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples following this event, but it's also understood as a future anterior tense, a sort of a future understanding that one can conscientiously exit the settler-interested modes of social production. And that's what she calls the kind of collaborative struggle that we need to enter into. And I think that resonates really well with the ideas of hauntology, new futures, cultures of listening, and sort of to link to the patchwork and the framework that Anne set up for us so beautifully. So thanks again for that. And thanks again for the challenge, Anne, and for the trust you put in us to rise to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. Brilliant. And if only we had lots and lots more time, but we will have time later to bring these together. And I'm now introducing, with great pleasure, Jovan Byford, who is going to take us forward, possibly in the same direction, possibly in a new one. Thanks, Jovan.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Anne, for this fascinating and very inspiring talk. And I think you managed very nicely to situate our center within the efforts of what you call the kind of disruptive reimaginings of psychology. And I think generally, both as a sort of research center and a school and as a university as a whole, we do have this emphasis on doing research with a societal purpose. In fact, I believe that kind of identifying and meeting societal challenges is one of the kind of the cornerstones of the research plan that is being established for the university as a whole. And I think your talk did really nicely to kind of identify some of these challenges, but also how we as psychologists could begin to kind of rise up to them and meet them, but through this kind of socio-historically situated psychology that you advocated. What I wanted to kind of reflect on and sneak in a question, if that is okay, from the perspective of a discussant, is to slightly kind of ask about the development and the current understanding of the overall concept of intersectionality. Now, my understanding is that, and you mentioned and referred to this in your talk as well, is that intersectionality, the notion of intersectionality, has been a very useful analytical tool, a way of sort of doing critical social theory, if you like. But also it has been for many decades a basis for political activism. And you mentioned in your talk that for decades before Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term and brought it into kind of the world of academia, it had been used by Black feminist movements to articulate this complex intersections of class, gender, and racial inequalities, both in America and elsewhere. So in some sense, when we look at intersectionality, it is both an analytical framework, but it is also a form of political practice. So when we draw on kind of insights from intersectionality, that is not just about thinking about the world, but it is about doing things in the world. But when I was looking a bit in preparation for today about how the term intersectionality is used, I think that there is a slight tension between the kind of theoretical understandings of intersectionality and how it can be taken into practice. And part of this tension arises from the fact that as an analytical tool, intersectionality emphasizes and in some sense celebrates complexity of categorizations, of identities, of intersections, and so on. But if it's conceptualized in this way, it also creates a challenge for progressive politics, because by celebrating complexity, by emphasizing particularity of people's identities, of sources of inequality and so on, it has the capacity to fragment social movements. So it creates tensions within, especially within single axis movements, which are focused on as sometimes it's called, bigger issue like race, gender, or class. So the emphasis on the particularities within people's identities and so on tends to create tension. And I think one way in which this has been addressed in social movements is to give the notion of intersectionality a slightly different meaning than the way that it is used in maybe an academic setting. And I've noticed that intersectionality is increasingly being used in the context of what is termed intersectional solidarity, where it tends to signify kind of interconnected and intersecting nature of different struggles, and somehow something that mandates that disparate marginalized groups have an obligation to support each other. So it is less on looking at complexities and diversity of experiences within political projects to looking at creating solidarity between disparate political projects. And to me, that seems a very different understanding of intersectionality, slightly simplistic understanding of intersectionality, and one that seeks to, in some sense, overshadow and suppress one of the biggest advantages of intersectionality as a kind of social theory, which is to emphasize complexity and so on. So I wanted to basically ask you if you can to reflect on these different understandings of intersectionality, and also say a little bit about how does one enact intersectionality in practice. And one immediate kind of practical example that I could think of is that the Open University, like many universities, is working very hard to address what is typically referred to as the awarding gap. And this is something where I think intersectionality plays in really strongly, because there is an intersection between different sources of inequality, class, gender, race, and so on and so forth. And it is often the challenge is how to understand these intersections and how to go beyond simply trying to partial out the effects of different sources of inequality, because one of the key things that intersectionality teaches us is that it is not a question of simply partialing them out. It is a question of looking at how they are constitutive of each other and so forth. And I was just thinking that while one can understand how intersectionality enables us to analyze the sources of those inequalities, I think it would be really interesting to see how the intersectionality as an analytical framework can be taken into some sort of concrete practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jovan. Would you stay up, and Anne and Johanna, if you could come back, we could all be present. Thanks. Johanna's just coming now. So we're really doing very well for timing. We're only about, I think, 11 minutes behind or something, which on a morning, in conference terms is terrific. It's usually about 45 minutes by this point. So we'll run a little bit into lunch hour. We have a time now for questions, and we have some from the bulletin board. But I wondered, Anne, if you might like to begin by, I don't know if you want to respond specifically to Jovan or perhaps pick up on anything else that Johanna has said as well. Johanna, can you put on your camera? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's on. Sorry, can you not see me?
No. It's a mysterious black space.
I've put it on again.
Now we can see you.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Johanna and Jovan, for these really thoughtful responses, picking out different things. And Johanna, clearly, the way that you've brought together, for example, the Bignell theorization and what she's seeking to do with thinking about your cultures of listening and thinking about hauntology and imagined futures, I think just requires a lot more thinking and work, but is clearly potentially really fruitful, in coming to understand modes of listening. And what of the things that's interesting about your using the Bignell is it's what and who is being listened to, and it raises that whole issue of the things that we don't see, that we don't know we need to listen to, and how we can make those apparent. What made Simone Bignell, think about ancestral land and the building on it, and why that's important there and at that point, and so on. So it's as much thinking about what's brought into audition, rather like Tina Camp. What's in and what's outside the frame, and how can we find new ways of getting at that? I think it's really key. But thank you very much. Food for thought. And Jovan, thank you very much for, again, really thoughtful picking up of intersectionality and asking that question, because it's key. And just, I won't speak for too long, but I think there are really interesting issues to say. One of which is that I don't think a complex theorization of intersectionality fragments political action and activism in the way that people often think. The reason I don't is if you take a step back, mass movements always fragment because they don't take intersectionality into their heart. And the reason that becomes problematic is because it reproduces already existing power relations and becomes a top-down. We say that we're all the same and you mustn't speak out because you will fragment, whether it is Black power and Black consciousness and Black men saying, well, of course you mustn't say anything about gender because, what we want is equality. We want Black-white equality. So you know, then you must, what did Stokely Carmichael say? The place for women in the movement is prone. Great. Or whether in feminist movements, white women saying, and you know, I've been asked in the past myself, well, surely you think gender is more important than race, and we need to, do I? And so we need to get at that. It's an imposition top down of that maintains the political status quo. And of course it's going to fragment. Of course, Black women, lesbians, women who are working class and who see that the issues that they're faced with every day are not of great interest, you know, are going to speak out. So the fragmentation comes not from the complex theorization, but the failure to do complex theorization. What the complex theorization allows is strategic alliances. And strategic alliances that are not on the simplistic basis of we're marginalized, we have to support each other, regardless of content, but actually that recognizes situatedness. So it's worth allying with people over this particular issue that one's concerned with, whether it's, you know, for example, the 5 times more, because very quickly in 2019, a 5 times more movement started where Black women were so horrified to think that they'd never known that they're much more, you know, 5 times, more than 4 times actually it is, more at risk of dying. And of course there are many white women who are part of that, because everybody's horrified to learn it and to understand that in society where people are enumerated so much that those sorts of things are not made public. But, you know, then you're not going to ally with exactly the same people forever when you're concerned with, for example, about the awarding gap. So you deal specifically, you need inclusive data, and I've really come around to understanding the importance of that. And again, it's exactly the same question as with Johanna. How do you know what you're not knowing? How do you know how to make things evident? But then, you know, how strategically do you actually address the issue? So with social justice in view, rather than saying we'll ally with you because you're oppressed, of course, the issue is the thing at heart and at stake. So, I mean, that's just a very quick answer, but I don't think intersectionality is therefore problematic. But I would say that, of course, intersectionality has become the fastest growing theoretical perspective. And as with anything, as you know, that is a huge theoretical perspective, there are debates about how it ought to be applied, what should be within it, and debates and contestations that have changed over the last 40 years. You know, so yeah, there are contestations, but I don't think that it's problematic. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Anne, and thanks, Jovan and Johanna. Now, we've got some questions on the notice board, so I'm going to throw them to all of you. We'll give Anne speaker's privilege of taking first go at them, but if she thinks I'll pass it over, she can, and I'd also like to hear Johanna and Jovan's comments. So the first one is from Eleni Andreoli, our Director of Research. And she says the distinction between the everyday mundane and the extraordinary is very interesting. COVID brings the interconnection between the two into sharp focus, with a big disruptive event, the pandemic, and its very intimate everyday manifestations. Could you say a bit more about how you see this distinction between the ordinary and the extraordinary? What kind of tools does psychology have to study these connections?
What a lovely question. And again, I wouldn't necessarily want to make such a binary between the everyday mundane and the extraordinary. And I mean, I'm very interested in what both Jovan and Johanna has to say because of the things that they have studied that I think will throw a light on this. If one thinks about something like the pandemic, as Eleni has talked about COVID-19. One of the things that, of course, it's extraordinary, and it's hopefully we'll find that it's been 5 years of our lives, and that, you know, after that, that things are different, but that they are not pandemic related, you know, rather like, you know, the 1918 flu pandemic or bubonic plague lasted several years, but then things are different always afterwards, but not inflected in the same way. But as Eleni herself has said, it's not just that the pandemic is also lived intimately, but that it's also only apprehended in the everyday, in the mundane. And so you can only think about the extraordinary, the big picture, by understanding the differences that it produces, what it's like in the everyday. And psychology has got all sorts of ways of studying things that are both extraordinary, by asking people about them, by observations and so on, but also seeing how those affect how they think about themselves, obviously their identities, and so on and so forth. And I just can't see that those are binarized. If one thinks about the major thing of enslavement, we understand that you can only understand it properly by actually looking at what it was like in the everyday for both those who are enslaved and the enslavers, and people who were somewhere in between, in that they were sometimes the children, the mixed parentage children of enslavers, were sometimes in an in-between position in terms of being given property as enslaved peoples, but yet not being in the same position as the white children of those enslavers. So, you know, you can only really understand the major thing by understanding the everyday practices that produce it and the everyday impacts. So I can't see that there is, you know, whatever it is that's cataclysmic, that's large, that's being studied, psychology is interested, I think, in the mundanity of its impact on people. So I can't make that distinction so readily, but I think it's a lovely question. And perhaps I would like Jovan to start and Johanna to come in on that.
Yes, I think I agree. It's a very interesting question, but I think also I would say that another potentially interesting question for psychologists and social scientists generally is to analyze how particular events are constituted as cataclysmic, how we you know, how we use the term pandemic to refer to lots of different things, including the disease itself, the response to the disease, different responses to the disease, political crisis that emerges and kind of coincides with the pandemic, and so on. So I think a lot of you know, the object of study itself is in this case a construct that has different meanings and can be allocated different meanings, and I suppose its meanings are going to change going forward, you know, because there are lots of aspects of what we today refer to the pandemic as its consequences and so on that have merely been highlighted by the pandemic, but have very different origins, very different causes. And there is a danger of subsuming everything that is going on as part of the phenomenon of the pandemic, that I think sometimes requires and probably will need to be unpicked as we try to kind of make sense of what's going on.
Johanna? Yes, would
Yeah,
you like to come in?
Just as a comment, I want to come back to the notion of transformative conjunctions, because I think that captures really nicely what both of you said, particularly around the specificity of the energy that comes from the specific experiencing of certain events that cross certain boundaries and reposition people towards each other, but also can only be understood looking at the actual event as the actual people mundanely or extraordinarily are involved in them. And in this sense, I'd find that COVID, for example, shatters the idea of shared experience in a peculiar way for people who would normally not worry about that. So it sort of creates more minorities, different ways of not being heard and feeling excluded from things for reasons that one wouldn't have thought about beforehand, as well as throwing up, as Jovan said, new inequalities that we hadn't observed. And even bringing to the fore, I'm particularly focused on the issue of long COVID and the fact that certain autoimmune diseases that have been around a long time and were under research would now get more attention, and mostly those would affect women. And suddenly long COVID seems to be something that fits that bill, and all of a sudden it's of great interest. So suddenly that rises to the top. And then again, looking back, the question is why has nobody looked at these things when the symptoms often are fatigue and the kind of things that are very difficult to quantify and describe, and they might just be the regular experiences that women have in their lives. So being sent home by a doctor, not being taken seriously, which now all shifts because now we have to wrestle with the idea that people might have a legitimate reason to have those symptoms and to feel genuinely ill. So I find the idea of transformative conjunctions really helpful to think about the intersections or the kind of the nodal points at which new understandings can emerge, but which always come from a very specific and concrete issue that people are involved in, that you can only visit when you look at what I think the listening practices and as Anne said, what can be heard. And now, for example, someone who goes, I think conditions like fibromyalgia are now understood differently. So the doctors can now hear something that someone says about their symptoms that they couldn't previously hear, because the whole cultures of listening have been shattered a tiny bit. So this is an interesting way of understanding only through specific examples what is going on.
That's very interesting. And I think in some ways what you've been saying anticipates, is a slight answer in anticipation for a question that Jim Turner has asked. He's asked about macro level versus micro level in psychology. And he says, for example, systemic racism is a macro problem, but it happens through many individual micro actions. To borrow a thought from Billig, systemic racism isn't an agent that can do anything, rather people do things that create systemic racism. Us as psychologists, how can we best balance an understanding of macro level systems and the individuals who enact them, especially with the aim of driving positive change?
Okay. Again, of course, these questions are all very thoughtful. And of course, systems aren't agents, but it's worth thinking about the ways in which systems act. They may not be agentic, but because of the way in which they're set up, because of the constellation of people they bring together and practices they bring together and the different motivations. So, for example, a university as a system has all sorts of different motivations that produce sometimes practices that one can't always see would be in the best interest if one of any of its members if one started from scratch, because they've come top down, they've come from things to do with money and so on. So while of course it isn't the case that systemic racism is an agent, it's systemic because it acts, because it produces effects in itself, and it produces effects, of course, through its practices which involve people. But that means that one has to think about systems as also dynamic and productive, as well as at the micro level, and think about people as well as being at the micro level, as well as enacting things that affect systems and change them sometimes. or that perpetuate systems, so that they are enmeshed together. And it seems to me that one of the things that we need to do more as psychologists is, whatever level we're going in at, and I think it's legitimate to study anything, the system or the person or whatever, that we have to look at, what does this mean for another level? You know, they're always simultaneous levels operating. And what does it mean? And what is producing what? How do things go together? So that I think that while I can entirely agree that we don't treat systems as agents, I do want to see them as enacting things, and people as affecting systems. And therefore, when I want to study narratives of somebody in great depth, I want to think, what are the systems that are producing that way of understanding, or feelings that this is what has to be done, or the taken for grantedness, or the histories that have produced the normative understanding, or the resistance to the normative. So yeah, okay. So I'm very interested in what all three of you would have to say. Stephanie, why don't you have a go at answering that before Johanna and then Jovan?
I find it very persuasive. I mean, we could translate it into the language of discourses or whatever, but I think it's important to avoid a kind of individualism which suggests that each of us is in total control of our situations and the consequences of our actions, which doesn't mean we don't have a responsibility to try to change. But the obvious case with systemic racism or structural racism, if we follow Macpherson, would be to suggest, well, this is a nice person, excuse me, who doesn't want to be racist, and therefore they can't possibly be doing anything which has racist consequences or functions to exclude, to discriminate, to damage other people. And of course, the simple answer is yes, they can. And we need to understand the kind of complicated consequences, as you say, the histories, the taken for granted, which always incredibly interests me, what is simply invisible. And in my language terms, I suppose a lot of what you've all been discussing is about things coming out of the taken for granted, the invisible, the silenced, the ignored, and being sort of given a focus. And I think the older sort of concept of things being unmarked and becoming marked is always of interest to me. That point when something like maternal deaths, has simply not been marked as an issue. And I realize that marked can have a different use as well, but is pulled out and therefore becomes of significance. And we're kind of constantly in that process, aren't we, of things being pulled out of silence into audibility, visibility, and significance. So that'd be my point. I don't know, Johanna, Jovan?
I just saw Jim's question in the chat, and I think he mentioned sort of systemic racism as a macro problem and the individual's micro actions. I think this is I would frame the issue slightly differently. I don't think that systemic racism is a macro phenomenon and individual actions are a micro phenomenon. I think I think we should look at those as really the macro and micro constituted in each other. And I think if one looks at Billig's work, one of his motifs that sort of permeates his work is precisely to look at the way that these macro issues, if you like, the whole history of racism, inequality, etc., perpetuate or rather permeate individual actions and thinking and so on. So this distinction between macro as a societal problem and micro as an individual action needs to be interrogated and problematized. And I agree, Stephanie, you mentioned kind of the way that kind of Macpherson report kind of problematized this idea of systemic racism and so on. I think Macpherson used the term unwitting racism, where he was trying to identify precisely that point, is that, you know, you can have institutions in which there are no racists, or rather everybody claims that they're not racist, and yet there is clearly a problem with an institution which perpetuates particular attitudes, language, and so on and so forth. And I think that understanding institutional racism involves not just understanding this perpetuation of racism, but understanding how an institution can continue to perpetuate racism while maintaining that image of itself as somebody who has moved beyond racism and is functioning in a completely egalitarian way. And that's kind of the discursive element in it, comes with the argumentation, with the legitimization of particular inequalities, and actually maintaining them at the level of practices, at the level of, you know, bureaucratic documents, at the level of, you know, how one deals with complaints and so on, and rather than on the kind of this, what in the question was referred to as the micro actions.
This is just to add to that. I think for that reason, it's so important. I like this concept that Simone Bignell has about collaborative struggle and being educated how to listen, because then you don't have to draw the divides between the racist and the non-racist, and those who see themselves as not and would then be finding it offensive to be told they are. But the understanding that it's about collaboratively struggling to change those modes of listening, and that probably we don't yet know how to listen properly, and we need to be educated about it, or neither side knows how to listen. So the idea of there not necessarily being sides, that brings us back to the intersectionality and the divide and rule idea of if the different groups set off against each other, then the productive discourse is sort of destroyed, and you fall back into, are you for this, or is that more important, or that? But to be on the ground, understanding as a collaborative struggle for different ways of listening, and maybe modes of listening that haven't been tried yet. So it is neither might understand how this listening should actually work. So I think then Simone theorizes this really well, and I wanted to come back to that point Anne made earlier about the importance of theory that frames how these things can operate. So that the problem isn't so much too much theory, but a lack thereof in those kind of discussions.
Great. Well, look, I've said we'll run a little into lunchtime, if that's okay by all of you. So there's one more question I'd like to take, and I'm going to append a bit to it with Chair's privilege. Sarah Crafter, thanks you for the talk, Anne, and she said, it feels like discourse in the public sphere is increasingly dichotomized, perhaps overly amplified by social media. In the last 24 hours, this has shown itself in the mask, not mask online camps. Someone on Twitter mentioned that it felt like Remain, Leave all over again. Is intersectionality an answer to this? And how can we bring complex dialogue into public spheres? And I'd like to add to that, I think it links a thought that I had during your talk, Anne, which was about how much of, you know, collective histories and so on, we are kind of assuming interaction and dialogue. And yet at the moment, it feels as if a lot of people are isolated. Now, we never have that sort of perfect society where everyone's walking around arm in arm having thoughtful conversations, but it does feel as if we've got a new set of circumstances where people are particularly dependent on different forms of communication. And I would add, how do you think that affects complex dialogue in public spheres?
Well, again, a great question. And what is clear is that social media has made evident the made evident and indeed made more possible the very, very disparate and contradictory ways in which people behave. Okay, and so you do get people. For example, I'm on the behavioural advisory group of Independent Sage, which is a group that set itself up because it wasn't happy with, some of the members are on Sage, it wasn't happy with the ways in which the government was taking on the advice and not making things public and so on. So every Friday, SAGE, I'm in the behavioural advisory group, I'm not on independent SAGE, has a public meeting. And one of the things I've been so struck by are, I mean, you cannot imagine the sorts of social media that members who are giving up their time, you know, to try to make things clear, get from people. I mean, you know, death threats would perhaps be the easiest to deal with. But anyway, but one of the things that really strikes me is that those currents were always already in society. You know, that it's just that it was harder to make them quite so public to so many people all at once. But also that they're not the be all and end all, that people who send absolutely nasty messages can also sometimes, if they're confronted or if something else is said, actually change their minds, take things back, and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily as absolute as it always seems. So I'm saying that actually there have always been currents of real difference, but there's also potential for change, which doesn't make it easy. And I think intersectionality does help us to see that people can, at one and the same time, I mean, Stephanie, you talked about, you know, sort of people thinking of themselves as good people or other people thinking of them as good people, and yet at the same time perpetuating racism. But actually you can see that people can be positioned in very different ways, which is partly to do with their histories and partly to do with the social categories to which they belong, partly to do with the temporal period in which they are, and so on and so forth. So that complexity is recognizing that you cannot essentialize and say that because somebody is, you know, X, you know, living in poverty in the North, that they're definitely going to do Y, you know, whether it's voting behavior or ally with other people in other parts of the country, and so on. So yes, I think that the dialogue is complex, but I've also been struck by the fact that the pandemic has allowed other voices to be heard. So has the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. Things that one never did hear on the media have had to be, you know, enabled and changed. The fact that something like Marcus Rashford's campaign around food, with the Food Foundation, that's been chuntering away all the time, trying to change school meals for children, the fact that it becomes public what's happening with children and school, and that so many children are in food poverty in this country, you know, also changes people's minds. So it's not an absolutist position. People also do change their minds, and the divisions are great because, for example, you know, the mask, not mask, the opening up, not opening up, are divides that people feel very strongly. But that I think that we can understand where they come from. And one of the things that I've certainly argued quite strongly, for example, around vaccines, is that treating people as either taking up the vaccine or not is ridiculous. It's a dynamic situation, and therefore that what you need to argue for psychologically is giving people time, actually listening, in Johanna's terms, to what it is that they say, which are a plethora of reasons, some of which come from history and feeling, for example, that Black people, that Asian people have things tried out on them all the time, that nobody values their lives. So it's dangerous to allow yourself to be vaccinated in that context with something new, through to, you know, what's in it that they're not telling us about, or let's wait and see how many people suffer before I myself put myself forward, or I cannot take time off. I mean, it's all very well for academics to wander down to vaccination centres, but if you've got to take half a day off in order to get there and get it done, and you're going to lose half a day's pay, and make the choice then, do you feed your child, or, you know, with that lack of pay, or what? It's very different. So really listening and coming up with solutions that address all those things, and then also giving people time. So that's a very small example of saying that actually, rather than treating it in an absolutist way, intersectionality helps us to see the complexity of what we also have to do to address those things, and not failing to recognize the nastiness of some of the divisions, but also that they were there. You know, when I was a class rep in St Andrews, I got nasty letters from, you know, which really shook me, because I didn't know which of my colleagues were sending me letters about what they thought about Black people. And no doubt if social media had been possible, it would have been easier for them to amplify it, for many more to do it, and so on. But I cannot believe that this is something absolutely new. But, you know, maybe you'll all tell me differently. And when I say you all, I mean the three of you that I'm waiting to hear from.
Unfortunately, I wouldn't try to tell you differently. I'm currently reading a biography of a Iranian refugee woman who's now an MP in New Zealand, and she described how a colleague put her onto Twitter and said it'll be all right, and then looked at what came through and said, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, and took her off it again. Let me pass over to Johanna maybe, and then Jovan.
Yeah, I can only agree. I don't know. It's in the stories, and I don't know. It's also, this is something I thought about when I listened to your talk, about the way the futures are imagined and the kind of creativity and boldness with which we do that. And there's a tiny anecdote that sort of sits sideways to what we were discussing, but it seems to capture some of this backwards and forwards between how to imagine a future and how to overcome struggles and divisions. We, in our little market town, there was a sustainability fest with market stalls, and people would sort of, local climate activists had sort of pie charts built up, big ones, with before Homo sapiens, 1870, and today, and they were showing biodiversity dwindling, and there were lots of little animals sat on the first one and much fewer on the second one, more people, and mostly chickens, beef, cows, and sheep. And then on the last one is all red, just cow, sheep, chicken, and humans, and very few animals. And the lady involved my 8-year-old son into a conversation and said, look, this is how the animals are vanishing, they haven't got space to live. And would you commit as a child now to only have 2 children when you're grown up and to consume less? And he nods enthusiastically, and he thinks that's a brilliant idea, and points to the first pie chart and said, yeah, that's where we need to get back to, that's it. And then she looked a bit baffled and said, but there are no humans on that one. Yeah, that's great. So it's a kind of really weird idea of a future that's the past. And he's understood that this is not a very ambitious plan for how to address climate change. So I thought that was a really interesting and well-meaning way of crossing a divide, but not really speaking to anyone when you think, well, these children, they will have much more ambitious and interesting ideas on how to fix that problem than we seem to be suggesting. So it's sort of redividing can't help. So I thought that was a really weird way of capturing how the lack of ambition and imagination leads to kind of very weird outcomes when those things are attempted.
Especially, I think if you gave any child the choice between people and dinosaurs, you know which way they'd go. Jovan, would you like to come in for any point on that?
Not just children, I know which way I would go. But yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly the best person to comment on social media. My enduring principle in life has been that social media is only good for asynchronous communication with relatives that you'd rather not communicate directly, and I'm sticking to that. But generally, I think that you know, social media, and particularly Twitter, because it involves 147 or whatever it is characters, is really not conducive to a sensible conversation, and it does invite, as Anne said, these kind of really nasty commentary. And I think that if one looked I don't know whether anybody has done it or will do this kind of analysis, but you know, there was a lot of concern over, for instance, the rates of vaccination and how many people are going to take the vaccine in the UK. And I think that opinion polls suggest that, you know, when they asked people how many of them would take the vaccine in November last year, it was around 60%. And as soon as the vaccines became available in December, it became 90%. There are certain elements within which, if one looks at what is happening in the UK and compares it to other societies, people have actually been remarkably sensible in their response to measures, to pandemic, to social distancing, and so on. And I think that it is perfectly possible that that will continue regardless of what the government does and what it does with the measures, or what kind of wars are going on Twitter or Facebook.
Let us hope. I think I must stop this. I would like to keep asking you questions and inviting everybody's responses and so on, but we have run into the lunch hour. And thank you very, very, very much on behalf of the Cultural and Social Psychology Group, on behalf of the New Research Centre, and on behalf of all of us. It's been a brilliant session. And Johanna and Jovan, thank you very much for your contributions as well.
Well, thank you. I just really think that you've been wonderful today, and that the centre is a really, really good and hopeful site, and that I look forward to hearing more about what you're all doing. But thank you very much, Stephanie. Wonderful chairing. Johanna and Jovan, thank you for engaging with the talk, and the questions as well, I think were really thought-provoking, and I've enjoyed hearing your responses as well. So thank you.